Hello, everyone. Greetings from Siberia. First, I would like to thank Asa, Buhu, and Christina for inviting me to this session. As an archaeologist, I specialize in regional settlement pattern studies. This is where we typically take a contiguous region, conduct a full coverage survey, determine roughly how many people lived where, and based on that, answer a number of questions about the socio-political organization of the societies that we study. For example, we've taken a 40 square kilometer area, found out that in a certain time period, roughly 600 people lived there. Most of the people lived in small villages, about 50 to 100 people each. Some percent of the population lived in small hamlets, 10 to 30 people each, probably representing 1 to 2 extended families. And all of these populations grouped into two clearly defined supralocal population clusters separated by a non-settled zone. Knowing these basic types of demographic data are essential for understanding the lives of these populations that we study. When it comes to Bronze Age Eurasia, such regional and micro-regional level demographic reconstructions are extremely rare. For example, I know of only three for this entire region. Why do people in the Eurasian steppes tend to shy away from producing demographic population estimates? Well, the number one reason, in my opinion, is supposedly the high level of mobility of these populations. For example, it is difficult to delineate the communities of mobile societies because they don't live in one place all year round like agriculturalists do. Also, the ecological forces connected with mobile pastoralism, they tend to pull populations apart, preventing the kind of demographic centralization that we normally see in farming societies. But at the same time, in different parts of the Eurasian steppes during the Bronze Age, we have evidence for settled sedentary living. One of such regions is the southern Trans-Urals. This is an area lying just to the east of the southern edge of the Ural Mountains, encompassing parts of modern-day Russia and northern Kazakhstan. What we see there in the first and in the second phases of the late Bronze Age are a bunch of settlements. Some of them are fortified, some are unfortified, big, small settlements with different types of spatial layouts, and so on. Couldn't we somehow count up these regional populations in order to get at the spatial and demographic community structure? Before we start doing that, we need to determine how mobile these people were, because as you can see from this table, this issue is far from being clear. Some authors think they were sedentary. Others think that all or the vast majority of the populations inhabiting these settlements were seasonally mobile, which, according to the definition of Anatoly Hazanov, constitutes nomadic pastoralism. So what I'll do in the remaining time, I'll go over some of the main lines of evidence that suggest sedentism. Then I'll go over the lines of evidence that suggest seasonal mobility. And at the end, try to present you with a synthesis of these data. First line of evidence that suggests sedentism is the substantial amount of labor investment into house architecture. In particular, these LBA societies lived in large semi-subterranean houses that were separated into multiple rooms or sections. They were built mainly out of wood, combined with clay, mud brick, sod, and other building materials. Each house contained a well or a few wells. Each house contained a hearth or a few hearths. The wells were about 1.5 meters in diameter. Their walls were layered with woven together twigs and wooden stakes, and both the wells and the hearths were covered with domed mud brick structures. At some settlements, we see the use of fired brick. For example, hundreds of such small fired brick fragments have been recovered from the settlement of Kipir, located along one of the tributaries of the Tobol River. Each house contained storage pits. Some storage pits were small, enough for a vessel to fit in. Others were large walk-in cellars with earthen steps leading into them. We also see in some of these houses what we would today call home improvements. For example, walls covered with plaster, wooden floors, vestibules or short entry hallways, and other house extensions such as outside overhangs, roofed porches. We see entry ramps, earthen furniture in the shape of beds and tables, and so on. Long-term use of these structures is further evidenced by traces of house repair. For example, in some structures, we see numerous post holes. In single period structures, we also see enlarged post holes. We see numerous wells in a single structure that by some researchers is interpreted as evidence of long-term use. For example, after a while, a well would collapse or get contaminated, and people would fill it up and dig another well right next to it and keep living in the same structure. We also see at these settlements robust accumulations of human garbage. They show up during the excavations as gray-colored layers filled with ash, fragments of animal bones, ceramic shards, and other refuse. They're called asheries in regional literature, and these trash middens can reach the size of up to 500 square meters in area, and they can be up to 70 centimeters thick. On the right-hand portion of the slide, you see the excavation plan of the Mirny 4 settlement, and the asheries are in brown. One of these asheries is bigger than the house itself, and in this particular case, these cultural layers were about 40 centimeters thick on average. Another line of evidence for sedentism comes from herd composition. The LBA herds are predominated heavily by cattle, and this is very uncharacteristic of the ethnographically recorded mobile pastoralists of the Eurasian steppes, which preferred more mobile species in their herds, like horses or sheep and goat. And there are a number of biological reasons for this, which we don't have time to discuss right now. Another lines of evidence comes from osteological data, in particular the presence of seasonal fauna and the dental cementum increment analysis point to these settlements being occupied during all 4 seasons, which goes against the hypothesis that these settlements were occupied only during the cold season and then abandoned in the summer. The comparison of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium isotope data from human and animal teeth and bones to the background values have allowed Ventresca, Miller, and colleagues to conclude the following. All ruminants, which constitute about 94% of the LBA herds, were pastured locally meaning within 15-kilometer radii from their respective sites, and the majority of humans also grew up locally. Other strontium isotope studies point to the fact that the animals were also pastured locally within 5 to 15-kilometer radii from their respective sites. Another line of evidence comes from pottery. Mobile societies usually use very few, if any, pottery. If we look at it cross-culturally at seasonally mobile societies, the pottery they do use is usually of low labor investment, expedient type, and that pottery is usually limited to just 1 or 2 morphological types. And that is not what we see in the LBA. In the LBA, we see lots of pottery. For example, it's not unusual to recover 1,000 or more sherds during the excavations of one LBA house. This pottery is finely made. It is always tempered. most of the pottery um, has, displays surface treatments like ornamentation, smoothing, and so on. And there are different morphological types and different sizes of pots, which, points to a pretty developed ceramics tradition. These were the main line of arguments for sedentism. What are the lines of arguments for mobility? They stem basically from two lines of evidence. One, of course, is ethnohistorical. Since about 800 BC, since the beginning of the Iron Age, the bulk of the central steppe populations were nomadic, and we know this quite well from the historical and from the ethnographic sources. And this long-term tendency for mobility is usually explained by the ecological considerations. In particular, pastoralist societies own a lot of livestock. This livestock eats a lot of grass. After a while, your animals will eat up all the grass, and you need to move them periodically in order to sustain them. And this notion is considered so obvious and so self-evident that it is rarely being tested with empirical data. It is rarely being challenged or questioned. Those researchers who did try to test this notion with empirical data in the southern Trans-Urals agree that circumferences with the radii ranging from 4 to 7.5 kilometers would be sufficient for the year-round sustenance of herds associated with populations consisting of 270 to 460 people without any substantial pasture degradation in the long run. These calculations were done for the fortified Sintashta and Petrovka settlements, which, according to the Bronze Age Eurasian steppe standards, included quite large human collectives. So why, despite the overwhelming evidence for sedentism, which is defined here as year-round occupation of a certain locale, do researchers still argue that these LBA populations of the southern Trans-Urals were nomadic, which is defined here as a situation where all or the vast majority of the population moves periodically together with the herds? I think this is happening because the proponents of the nomadic idea are over-influenced by the ethnographic record. As you all know, there is a rich ethnographic record that dates from the 16th to the early 20th century AD that describes in great detail the lifestyle of the Eurasian nomads of the central and eastern steppe. But as was hopefully demonstrated in this case, the ethnographic record simply does not match the archaeological data. And a reevaluation of the previously held nomadic view of these societies is also underway in other regions of the steppes, for example, in the Inner Asian mountain zone. But what sets the southern Trans-Urals apart, and one of the factors that makes it especially interesting, is that in the time period that I talked to you about today, there is no evidence so far of any domesticated crops. But that's another topic for discussion that we unfortunately don't have time for today. I thank you all for your attention and have a great conference.